The avoidant appears fine, composed, detached, moving through life with apparent ease. Their exterior suggests someone unbothered by the emotional chaos that consumes others. They don't chase, don't beg, don't fall apart when relationships end. This presentation is so convincing that most people, including their partners, never see what's happening beneath the surface. But the avoidant isn't fine. They're collapsing. Not outwardly, not in ways that draw attention or sympathy, but internally. The collapse happens in private, in the dark hours when no one is watching. In moments of breakthrough awareness, they immediately suppress. The shame they carry is so profound and so unacknowledged that it shapes their entire existence. They've built their life around avoiding this shame, and the effort of avoidance is destroying them slowly. The spiral operates invisibly, consuming them from the inside while their external presentation remains intact. The core shame foundation. The avoidance shame isn't about specific actions or mistakes. It's existential shame about who they fundamentally are. Deep beneath the defensive layers lives a belief that they are unlovable, defective, and unworthy of connection. This belief formed early, usually in response to caregivers who were emotionally unavailable, dismissive, or inconsistent. The child needed love and attachment, but those needs were met with rejection or indifference. The developing mind couldn't process this as the caregiver's limitation. It processed it as evidence of the child's unworthiness. If a parent cannot love their own child consistently, the child concludes something must be fundamentally wrong with them. The shame gets reinforced through years of relational patterns. Every time the avoidant pulls away from intimacy, every time they sabotage connection, every time they hurt someone who cares about them, it confirms the core belief. They are damaged. They are incapable of love. But acknowledging this shame directly would be unbearable. So the avoidant develops elaborate defenses. They reframe their inability to connect as preference for independence. They interpret their fear of vulnerability as strength. They construct an entire identity around not needing what they desperately need but believe they cannot have. The foundation of shame explains behaviors that otherwise seem contradictory. The avoidant simultaneously believes they don't need connection and feels devastated by isolation. They push people away while desperately wanting to be pursued. These contradictions make sense through the lens of core shame. The avoidant wants connection but believes they're unworthy of it. They need love but expect rejection. The collapse begins with this foundational belief that they are fundamentally unlovable. The mask maintenance exhaustion. The avoidant spends enormous energy maintaining the facade that they're fine, independent, and unbothered. This performance isn't conscious manipulation. It's a survival strategy that has become automatic. They've learned that showing need leads to rejection, that expressing vulnerability invites hurt. So they present a carefully curated version, competent, self-sufficient, emotionally stable. This mask allows them to move through the world without constantly confronting their shame, but maintaining the performance is exhausting in ways that compound over time. The exhaustion manifests as a pervasive sense of being drained without clear cause. The avoidant can't identify why they're so tired, because they're not consciously aware of the constant effort of self-monitoring and emotional suppression. Subscribe for weekly insights on attachment that go beyond surface explanations to help you actually understand what's driving these behaviors. This hypervigilance about self-presentation becomes so automatic that the avoidant doesn't recognize it as work. But the nervous system knows. The body keeps score of the constant performance. The mask also requires the avoidant to suppress their authentic emotional experience. When they feel lonely, they cannot show it. When they miss someone, they must hide it. This split between internal experience and external presentation creates profound alienation from self. The avoidant becomes a stranger to themselves, disconnected from their own needs and desires. This disconnection is a form of collapse that happens so gradually they don't notice until they realize they don't know who they are beneath the performance. The intimacy approach withdrawal cycle. The avoidant experiences intimacy as both desperately wanted and fundamentally threatening. This creates a cyclical pattern where they move toward connection when they feel safe distance and withdraw when connection becomes too real. The cycle generates shame at every turn. When the avoidant withdraws, they feel shame about hurting their partner. When they approach, they feel shame about needing someone. There's no position in the cycle that doesn't activate shame. The cycle intensifies over time because each iteration adds new layers of shame. The avoidant sees themselves repeat the pattern, recognizes they're hurting people they care about, and feels powerless to stop. When closeness triggers their attachment wounds, the defensive response is automatic. They withdraw despite their best efforts, and this failure to control their own behavior deepens their shame. The cycle also creates shame about the impact on partners. The avoidant watches confusion and pain develop in people who care about them. They see partners question themselves, blame themselves for the avoidant's withdrawal. The avoidant knows they're causing this harm, but feels unable to stop. They want to explain, but explaining would require vulnerability their defenses won't allow. The comparison and inadequacy trap. The avoidant constantly compares themselves to people who seem capable of healthy relationships and finds themselves lacking. They watch others form bonds that look easy and natural, and they feel fundamentally deficient. They see couples communicate about problems, work through conflicts, and maintain intimacy through challenges. These observations confirm their shame-based belief that something essential is missing in them. The inadequacy becomes particularly acute when the avoidant is in relationship with someone secure or anxious who demonstrates capacity for emotional presence. The partner can express feelings, ask for needs to be met, tolerate vulnerability. The avoidant watches this and feels their own limitations sharply. They cannot match their partner's emotional availability. The gap between what they can offer and what healthy relationship demands becomes undeniable. The comparison also extends to their own past selves, or idealized versions of who they wish they could be. The avoidant remembers moments when they were more open, or imagines a version of themselves who could sustain intimacy. The distance between that imagined self and their actual behavior creates shame. This internal comparison is particularly painful because it's about the gap between who they want to be and who they keep proving themselves to be. The shutdown spiral mechanics. When shame becomes too intense, the avoidance nervous system initiates a shutdown response. This isn't a conscious choice, but an automatic protective mechanism. The shutdown manifests as emotional numbness, dissociation from present experience, and a sense of being behind glass observing life rather than living it. The avoidant goes through motions without feeling anything. The shutdown protects them from overwhelming shame by creating distance from all feeling. But this protection comes at the cost of being present for their own life. The shutdown spiral deepens because numbness itself becomes something to feel ashamed about. The avoidant recognizes they're not fully present, that they're missing experiences and connections. This recognition creates more shame, which triggers deeper shutdown, which creates more shame about being shut down. Each layer of shutdown, designed to protect against shame, actually generates more shame, which requires more shutdown. The mechanics also include the avoidance attempts to break out of shutdown that inevitably fail. They might try to force themselves to feel, to connect, to be present. These attempts come from shame about being shut down rather than genuine readiness. The forced attempts don't work because they're not addressing the underlying shame and fear. The avoidant fails to break out of numbness, which confirms they're broken, which deepens the shame. The relational pattern recognition horror. The moment the avoidant becomes conscious of their patterns is devastating. They suddenly see clearly that they repeat the same cycle in every relationship. They pursue someone until intimacy develops, then withdraw and destroy the connection. This recognition is horrifying because it reveals that the problem isn't the partners or circumstances. The problem is the avoidant themselves. They are the common variable in every failed connection. The pattern recognition also forces the avoidant to count the damage they've caused. They mentally review past partners, remembering the confusion and pain they left behind. The sum total of damage becomes undeniable. The avoidant sees themselves as a force of destruction in others' lives. This perspective creates overwhelming shame and often triggers the avoidant to withdraw from relationships entirely. The horror of pattern recognition includes realizing that awareness doesn't equal control. The avoidant can see their patterns clearly, can predict exactly how they'll sabotage the next relationship, but this knowledge doesn't prevent the sabotage. The patterns run deeper than conscious understanding. The avoidant becomes a witness to their own destructive behavior, watching themselves repeat cycles they desperately want to stop but cannot. The achievement compensation failure. Many avoidants attempt to compensate for their relational failures through achievement in other domains. They pour energy into career, fitness, creative pursuits, or other measurable successes. The unconscious logic is that if they can achieve enough, if they can become successful or impressive enough, maybe they'll finally feel worthy despite their relational incapacity. For a time, this compensation strategy works. The avoidant can point to their accomplishments and feel some sense of worth. The external validation from achievement temporarily quiets the shame about their inability to sustain intimacy. But the compensation strategy ultimately fails because achievements don't address attachment wounds. The avoidant can become wildly successful, can accumulate impressive credentials and accomplishments, and the core shame remains untouched. They're still fundamentally alone. they still cannot connect authentically with others. The failure of achievement to fill the relational void creates a specific crisis. If even success and accomplishment cannot make them feel worthy or whole, what will? The avoidant confronts the reality that no amount of external validation can heal the internal shame they carry. The failure also manifests as emptiness at moments that should be triumphant. The avoidant achieves something significant and has no one to share it with. Or they do share it, but cannot feel the connection that would make the sharing meaningful. The accomplishment rings hollow without authentic relationship. The avoidant recognizes that success without connection is just another form of isolation. They've built empires or mastered skills, and none addresses the shame that drives them. The therapy and healing resistance. The avoidant knows they need help, but accessing help requires vulnerability they cannot tolerate. Therapy means admitting problems, revealing wounds, and depending on another person for support. All of these violate the avoidant's core defenses, so they resist seeking help, or they enter therapy but cannot engage authentically, or they sabotage the therapeutic relationship when it becomes meaningful. This resistance to the very thing that could help them deepens their shame. They know they need to change. They can see that their patterns are destroying their life, but they cannot make themselves vulnerable enough to receive support. The awareness that they're preventing their own healing creates a shame spiral of its own. The resistance also stems from shame about needing help itself. The avoidance identity is built on self-sufficiency. Admitting they cannot heal themselves, that they need another person's guidance and support, feels like admitting fundamental weakness. It confirms the core belief that they're defective. If they were strong like they claim to be, they wouldn't need therapy. If they were as independent as they perform, they could fix themselves. Needing help proves they're frauds, that the performance of strength has been covering deep weakness all along. This shame about needing help prevents them from getting help, which ensures they remain stuck in patterns they cannot break alone. The healing resistance includes the avoidance fear that therapy will make them too vulnerable, that opening their wounds will flood them with feeling they cannot manage. They worry that if they start feeling, they won't be able to stop, that the pain they've been suppressing will overwhelm and destroy them. This fear isn't entirely irrational. The avoidant has been avoiding their emotions for good reasons. Those emotions felt unmanageable when the defenses were first constructed. But the emotions don't become more manageable through continued avoidance. They intensify and become more dangerous. The avoidant is caught between two fears: the fear of being overwhelmed by feeling if they open up, and the fear of slowly dying inside if they don't. The substance and distraction dependencies. Many avoidants develop dependencies on substances or behaviors that help them avoid feeling their shame. Alcohol, drugs, work, exercise, sex, gaming, or endless consumption of media. These aren't necessarily full addictions, though they can become that. They're more often patterns of avoidance that help the avoidant stay disconnected from their internal experience. The shame about needing these distractions creates another layer of the spiral. The avoidant recognizes they're using unhealthy coping mechanisms, but feels unable to stop, because stopping would mean confronting the feelings the distractions are covering. They know they're avoiding, They feel shame about the avoidance, but the shame makes them need the avoidance more. The dependencies also represent the avoidance attempt to create connection or feeling in ways that don't require vulnerability. Substances can create temporary feelings of warmth, openness, or connection without the risk of real intimacy. Work can provide sense of purpose and accomplishment without emotional exposure. Sex can offer physical closeness without emotional availability. These substitutes never fully satisfy the underlying need for authentic connection, but they're safer than the real thing. The avoidant knows these are substitutes, knows they're settling for less than what they actually need, and this knowledge creates shame that drives deeper into the dependencies. The cycle of dependency and shame becomes particularly vicious when the avoidant recognizes how much of their life is organized around avoidance. They see that their entire existence has been structured to prevent feeling. Their schedule is packed with distractions. Their relationships are kept superficial. Their inner life is constantly interrupted by consumption or activity. They're running from themselves, and the running has become so constant they don't know how to stop. The shame of recognizing they're fleeing their own life, that they're terrified of their own internal experience, that they cannot sit with themselves for even a few minutes, creates a despair that deepens the need for distraction. The spiral tightens until the avoidant barely exists outside of their avoidance mechanisms. The aging and time awareness crisis. As the avoidant ages, they become increasingly aware of time passing and opportunities lost. They look back at years of avoided intimacy and forward to years of likely continued isolation. This temporal awareness creates acute shame about wasted life. The avoidant sees peers building families, deepening relationships, creating lives rich with connection. They see themselves alone, defended, repeating the same patterns that have never worked. The gap between where they are and where they could have been if they'd faced their fears becomes painfully visible. They feel they've squandered their life protecting against vulnerability that, in retrospect, might have been survivable. The crisis intensifies with the recognition that they're running out of time to change. The patterns have calcified over decades. The defenses have become personality. The avoidant worries they've left healing too late, that they've become too damaged or too set in their ways to develop new relational capacity. They imagine dying alone, having never experienced the sustained intimacy that gives life meaning. This vision of their probable future creates a horror that coexists with the inability to change. The avoidant can see clearly what they're headed toward and feels powerless to alter course. The shame of watching yourself waste your life while being unable to stop wasting it is perhaps the deepest form of the collapse. The aging crisis also includes shame about being older and still struggling with issues that feel adolescent. The avoidant in their 40s, 50s, or beyond feels they should have figured this out by now. They should be past attachment wounds, past being terrified of intimacy, past sabotaging every connection. The gap between their chronological age and their emotional development creates embarrassment and shame. They feel stunted, permanently stuck at an earlier developmental stage while the world moves on. This shame about arrested development becomes another reason to avoid connection. Who would want someone this damaged and underdeveloped? The question confirms the core belief about being unworthy and deepens the spiral into isolation and despair, the invisible suffering paradox. The final dimension of the avoidant collapse is that it happens entirely invisibly. The avoidant's suffering is real and profound, but receives no recognition or support because they've hidden it so successfully. Friends and family don't know they're collapsing because the avoidant continues to perform functionality. Partners don't see the shame spiral because the avoidant shows only detachment and indifference. Even the avoidant themselves sometimes lose track of how much they're suffering because the suppression has become so automatic. They exist in a paradox where they're drowning while appearing to swim effortlessly. The invisibility of their collapse means they remain unsupported, which deepens the collapse, which strengthens the defenses that keep the suffering invisible. The paradox creates a specific loneliness that compounds the shame. The avoidant suffers alone with no witness, no support, no acknowledgement that their pain is real and valid. They cannot reach out for help without violating the defenses that make reaching out impossible. They cannot show vulnerability without triggering the terror that the defenses protect against. So they collapse in private, in the dark hours, in moments when the mask slips and they see themselves clearly. And then they reconstruct the facade and return to the performance of being fine. The gap between internal collapse and external presentation becomes so vast that the avoidant feels like two different people, the one who is falling apart and the one the world sees. This split is itself a form of collapse, a fragmentation that makes integration and healing nearly impossible without intervention the avoidant cannot seek.